If challenges keep throwing you off center, the Unshakable Mind will help you build strength that nothing can shake. You'll turn setbacks into fuel and walk through storms with unshakable clarity and calm. The Bulletproof Mindset. Introduction. Life has a way of testing your mental fortitude when you least expect it. One moment you're confidently moving forward, the next you're knocked off balance by circumstances beyond your control. A harsh criticism splinters your confidence, an unexpected rejection derails your momentum, or uncertainty about the future paralyzes your ability to act. In these moments, your mind, your greatest asset, can feel like your greatest vulnerability. You've likely noticed those rare individuals who seem to possess an invisible shield against life's challenges. While others crumble under pressure, they remain centered. When faced with setbacks that would devastate most people, they adapt and grow stronger. Their resilience isn't just admirable, it's almost mysterious. What internal resources do they possess that you don't? Here's the transformative truth. The capacity for unshakable mental strength already exists within you. Your innate resilience hasn't vanished. It's simply buried beneath layers of reactive patterns and limiting beliefs that have accumulated over time. Just as a master craftsman can transform raw metal into an impenetrable fortress, you can forge your mind into an unbreakable force. Think of your mind as a fortress. Right now, its walls might be easily breached by external circumstances, each challenge creating cracks in your emotional stability. But through understanding the architecture of resilience, you can transform these same walls into an impregnable defense system. This isn't about becoming emotionally numb or detached. Rather, it's about developing such profound inner stability that external circumstances lose their power to derail you. The path to mental fortitude holds a counterintuitive truth. Real strength doesn't come from avoiding discomfort. It comes from transforming your relationship with it. Just as a blacksmith uses intense heat not to destroy metal but to strengthen it, life's challenges can either break you down or forge you into something more powerful. The difference lies not in the intensity of the heat, but in how you work with it. If you've tried other approaches to building mental strength without lasting results, you might feel skeptical. But this journey is fundamentally different. Instead of adding new techniques or complex strategies to your mental toolkit, you'll uncover and strengthen capabilities you already possess. You'll learn to access internal resources that have always been there, waiting to be activated. When you develop a bulletproof mindset, everything changes. Situations that once overwhelmed you become opportunities for growth. Conversations that would have triggered defensive reactions transform into chances for deeper understanding. Setbacks that seemed like endings reveal themselves as powerful beginnings. This isn't just about surviving life's challenges. It's about using them as catalysts for unprecedented growth. The journey ahead will challenge your assumptions about what's possible for you. Are you ready to discover just how strong your mind can become? Chapter 1. The Fortress and the Fog. What if the greatest threat to your mental stability isn't external pressure but internal fog? Modern neuroscience reveals a startling truth. Your brain doesn't simply record reality like a camera. It actively constructs your experience through layers of interpretation. Much like a medieval watchman trying to defend a fortress in dense fog, you're often unable to distinguish between genuine threats and harmless shadows. This perceptual haze isn't just inconvenient. It's the primary source of your mental vulnerability. You've experienced this phenomenon countless times. A neutral email from your boss triggers hours of anxiety. A minor disagreement with a loved one spirals into deep emotional turmoil. An unexpected change in plans completely derails your emotional stability. In these moments, you're not responding to reality itself, but to the distorted interpretation your mind has created through the fog of past experiences, unconscious beliefs, and emotional triggers. This reactive pattern of mind creates a perpetual state of vulnerability. Without recognizing the difference between what's actually happening and your interpretation of what's happening, you remain at the mercy of every thought, emotion, and circumstance that crosses your path. The brain's tendency to create meaning from even the most neutral situations means you're constantly reacting to stories rather than facts, to interpretations rather than reality. You might wonder how it's possible to see clearly when emotions are running high. The key insight is that you don't need to eliminate the fog. You only need to recognize its presence. This simple shift in awareness creates a crucial space between stimulus and response. When you understand that your mind is generating interpretations rather than perceiving objective reality, those interpretations immediately begin to lose their grip. This is where the clarity pause becomes transformative. It's not a technique to master, but a fundamental shift in how you relate to your experience. Before understanding this concept, you were likely fused with your interpretations, believing them to be reality itself. The thought, "they don't respect me," felt like an indisputable fact rather than one possible interpretation of a neutral situation. With the clarity pause, you gain the ability to recognize when you're caught in interpretation rather than seeing clearly. This doesn't require stopping your thoughts or changing your emotions. It simply means acknowledging the presence of mental fog. This recognition alone begins to dissolve the fog's power over you. The speed of emotional reactions might seem to make this impossible. However, just as your eyes naturally adjust to physical fog without conscious effort, your mind can learn to detect psychological fog automatically. The key is understanding that you don't need to fight or control the fog. You only need to recognize its presence. Mental clarity forms the foundation of an unshakable mind. Without it, even the most advanced psychological tools become merely sophisticated ways of responding to misperceptions. The fog isn't reality, it's your mind's interpretation of reality. As this distinction becomes clearer, you'll begin to notice specific patterns in how your mind creates vulnerability through its interpretations. Each time you catch yourself reacting strongly to a situation, pause to acknowledge the presence of mental fog. This isn't about analyzing or fixing your reactions, it's about recognizing that between the event and your response lies a layer of interpretation. This recognition alone begins to transform your relationship with challenging situations. Your mind's tendency to create stories and interpretations isn't a flaw, it's a natural function. The vulnerability comes not from having these interpretations, but from mistaking them for reality itself. As you learn to recognize the difference between actual events and your mind's interpretation of them, you begin building the foundation of true mental resilience. The real power lies in understanding that you don't need to wait for the fog to clear before you can function effectively. Just as a skilled navigator can work with limited visibility, you can learn to operate effectively even when mental fog is present. The key is remembering that the fog isn't the territory. It's just your mind's current way of mapping it. Chapter 2: Blueprints of Vulnerability. Imagine examining an ancient fortress not as a casual observer admiring its grandeur, but as an architect tasked with identifying its structural vulnerabilities. Your trained eye would look beyond surface-level cracks to recognize fundamental design flaws, places where the foundation isn't quite deep enough, where supporting walls lack proper reinforcement, or where the architecture itself creates inherent weaknesses. This precise type of examination is crucial when evaluating your mental landscape. Most people focus solely on strengthening their obvious mental assets while avoiding deeper examination of their vulnerabilities. This approach is understandable, but ultimately counterproductive. Just as an engineer must understand where a bridge might fail under pressure to properly reinforce it, you must recognize your mental breakthrough points to develop true resilience. Your vulnerability patterns, those recurring situations that consistently undermine your mental stability, aren't random. They follow specific blueprints shaped by your experiences, beliefs, and unconscious assumptions about how the world works. These patterns create predictable weak points in your mental architecture, where pressure consistently breaks through your defenses. The perfectionist pattern manifests as a mental architecture built on impossible standards. This creates structural weakness because the foundation itself, the belief that anything less than perfection equals failure, cannot support the weight of reality. Under pressure, this pattern leads to paralysis, burnout, or complete collapse when inevitably falling short of unrealistic expectations. The approval seeker pattern creates vulnerability through external dependency. Like a fortress that relies entirely on outer walls while neglecting internal supports, this mental architecture crumbles when faced with criticism or rejection. The structural flaw lies in placing the power to validate or invalidate your worth in others' hands. The controller pattern generates weakness through rigid inflexibility. This mental architecture, while appearing strong, lacks the adaptability necessary for true resilience. When faced with uncertainty or situations beyond control, this pattern creates severe stress fractures as reality collides with the need for absolute predictability. Understanding these vulnerability patterns requires looking beyond surface-level reactions to identify underlying structural weaknesses. When you feel overwhelmed by work pressure, is it really about the workload, or does it trigger a deeper perfectionist pattern? When criticism derails you, is it about the specific feedback, or does it activate an approval-seeking pattern that threatens your sense of worth? Vulnerability. Mapping involves examining situations that consistently trigger emotional reactivity, looking for common elements across seemingly different scenarios. This isn't about cataloging every emotional response, but identifying recurring patterns that indicate structural vulnerabilities in your mental architecture. The power of this examination lies not in dwelling on weaknesses, but in gaining the awareness necessary for targeted reinforcement. Just as an architect uses knowledge of structural vulnerabilities to design stronger buildings, understanding your mental weak points allows you to build genuine resilience where you need it most. This process requires courage. Many prefer focusing exclusively on strengths, viewing vulnerability assessment as unnecessary negativity. Yet this examination isn't about criticism. It's about clarity. Every breakthrough point you identify becomes an opportunity for strategic reinforcement. Every pattern you recognize loses some of its unconscious power over you. The goal isn't to eliminate vulnerabilities, but to understand them so thoroughly that they transform from hidden threats into known variables you can account for and strengthen. This understanding forms the foundation for developing a truly bulletproof mindset, one built not on denial of weaknesses, but on intimate knowledge of your mental architecture. Your vulnerability patterns, once clearly mapped, become guideposts for focused reinforcement. Through this lens, moments that trigger these patterns aren't failures, but opportunities to strengthen your mental architecture precisely where it needs it most. Your greatest vulnerabilities, once recognized, become your greatest opportunities for strength. This fundamental shift in perspective transforms the very nature of what you consider weakness, setting the stage for converting these breakthrough points into sources of unprecedented mental power. By bringing these perceived weaknesses into the light, you strip them of their subconscious influence and gain the ability to transform them into pillars of resilience. What once felt like cracks in your mental armor become the precise points where you can forge the strongest reinforcement, much like a blacksmith who knows exactly where a blade needs tempering. The areas that made you feel most exposed now serve as beacons, guiding you toward the exact places where focused attention will yield the most profound strengthening of your mental architecture. Chapter 3. The Alchemist's Mind. Throughout history, alchemists devoted their lives to an impossible dream, transforming lead into gold. While they never succeeded in physical transmutation, they unknowingly pointed toward a far more valuable form of alchemy, one that happens in the human mind. Your thoughts, even the most painful and toxic ones, contain hidden wisdom waiting to be extracted. You've likely experienced the crushing weight of negative thoughts that seem to poison your entire mental landscape. Perhaps you've tried positive thinking, affirmations, or simply pushing these thoughts away. Yet they return, sometimes stronger than before. This persistent cycle reveals a crucial truth. The path to mental strength isn't through avoiding difficult thoughts, but through transforming them. Consider how your immune system develops. Exposure to germs, while uncomfortable, strengthens your biological defenses. Similarly, your psychological immune system requires exposure to challenging thoughts to develop resilience. When you constantly shield yourself from mental discomfort, you actually weaken your capacity to handle life's inevitable difficulties. The conventional wisdom about staying positive and eliminating negative thoughts misses a fundamental truth about human psychology. Resistance creates persistence. When you fight against thoughts, you energize them. The more you try to suppress fear, self-doubt, or anger, the more these emotions dominate your mental landscape. True mental alchemy begins with a radical shift in perspective. Those thoughts you label as toxic, the ones about your inadequacies, your fears, your perceived failures, aren't your enemies. They're encrypted messages carrying vital information about your needs, values, and growth opportunities. The key is learning to decode rather than destroy them. When intense self-doubt arises, it often signals areas where you deeply care about performing well. Anxiety about the future frequently masks valuable protective instincts. Even harsh self-criticism, properly decoded, can reveal important standards you hold for yourself. These thoughts become toxic, not in their essence, but in how you process them. The process of thought alchemy involves 3 fundamental shifts in how you relate to difficult thoughts. First, you must develop the capacity to recognize toxic thoughts without becoming entangled in them. This means observing, "I'm not good enough," as a thought passing through your mind rather than an absolute truth about your worth. Second, extract the underlying message or value within the thought. What is this difficult emotion trying to tell you? What aspect of your life or well-being is it drawing attention to? Third, reformulate this insight in terms that serve rather than diminish you. Transform "I'm not good enough" into "I'm committed to growth in this area." This alchemical process doesn't eliminate mental discomfort, nor should it. Instead, it transforms your relationship with difficult thoughts from one of victimhood to empowerment. The very thoughts that once paralyzed you become catalysts for growth. When you feel overwhelmed by negative thinking, remember that gold doesn't emerge from lead without intense heat. The pressure you feel isn't a sign of weakness, but an essential part of the transformative process. Your task isn't to escape the heat, but to use it skillfully. The most bulletproof minds aren't those that never experience doubt, fear, or pain. They're the ones that have learned to extract wisdom from these experiences. Every toxic thought contains a seed of insight waiting to be germinated through proper processing. This transformative approach to difficult thoughts develops a psychological resilience far superior to mere positive thinking. Rather than creating a fragile mental state dependent on maintaining good thoughts, you build the capacity to find value in every mental state you experience. The thoughts that seem most poisonous often contain the medicine you most need. This principle of mental alchemy forms the foundation of unshakable resilience. While others crumble under the weight of difficult thoughts, you'll learn to transform them into fuel for growth. Each painful idea, each doubt that gnaws at your confidence, each fear that freezes you in place, these aren't your enemies, but encrypted messages waiting to be decoded. When you grasp this fundamental shift in perspective, you'll stop running from challenging thoughts and start mining them for the gold they contain. Your moments of greatest mental turbulence become opportunities for your most profound breakthroughs, not because you've learned to fight harder, but because you've discovered how to transform what once poisoned you into a source of strength. Chapter 4. The Observer's Perch. Picture yourself atop a mountain peak, watching an intense storm unfold in the valley below. Lightning fractures the sky, thunder rattles the earth, and rain pours in torrential sheets. Yet you remain completely dry, calm, and secure in your elevated position. This is more than a scenic image. It's a perfect metaphor for one of the most powerful capacities of the human mind. Most people spend their lives caught in the storm of their thoughts, believing they must either fight against the tempest or be swept away by it. You've likely experienced this yourself, moments when worry, anger, or fear seem to possess you completely. When you become so consumed by thoughts that you forget they're just thoughts. Even when you intellectually understand that thoughts aren't reality, they can feel overwhelmingly real in the moment. What transforms mental storms from overwhelming to manageable isn't changing their content, but changing your relationship to them. Just as a mountain isn't harmed by the storms that pass over it, your essential consciousness remains untouched by the thoughts moving through it. This isn't abstract philosophy. It's a practical reality that becomes clear the moment you recognize the distinction between having thoughts and being thoughts. Your mind naturally generates content constantly. Predictions, judgments, memories, fears, desires. This mental activity is both normal and necessary. The problem isn't the activity itself, but the unconscious identification with it. When you believe you are your thoughts, every negative thought becomes an existential threat. When you realize you are the awareness in which thoughts appear, even the most challenging mental content becomes manageable. Think of consciousness as a vast sky and thoughts as clouds passing through it. The sky isn't harmed by storms, darkened by gray clouds, or illuminated by sunny ones. It provides space for all weather, while remaining fundamentally unchanged. Your observing awareness functions the same way, offering boundless space for all mental experiences without being defined by any of them. This observing capacity, what psychologists call metacognition, is natural to all humans but often remains underdeveloped. Like an unused muscle, it requires conscious engagement to grow stronger. The good news is that this capacity strengthens quickly with intentional practice, creating increasing degrees of psychological freedom. From the perch of the observing mind, you gain a profound form of leverage over your mental experience. Rather than being swept along by every thought stream, you maintain a stable vantage point from which to witness mental activity without becoming entangled in it. This isn't about detachment or dissociation. It's about gaining the clarity that comes with psychological distance. The observing mind reveals that you are not your thoughts, but the awareness in which thoughts appear. This single recognition changes everything. Anxious thoughts may arise, but you're not an anxious person. Self-critical thoughts may surface, but you're not a self-critical person. You're the unchanging awareness that witnesses all these temporary phenomena. This capacity becomes particularly valuable during emotional intensity. When triggered, most people become their triggers, completely identified with and defined by the activated mental content. From the perch of the observing mind, you maintain perspective even when powerful emotions arise. You can acknowledge the storm while remaining anchored in the deeper stillness of awareness itself. Some resist this practice, believing that stepping back from thoughts means becoming passive or disconnected. The opposite is true. Only by creating space between yourself and your thoughts can you respond wisely rather than react automatically. This is the foundation of emotional intelligence and mental resilience. The key is remembering this capacity exists, especially when you need it most. Just as the sky doesn't have to remember to be spacious, it's naturally spacious. Your consciousness doesn't have to become observant. It already is. You simply have to recognize and rest in this natural capacity rather than habitually identifying with every passing thought. When you consistently view mental activity from the perch of awareness rather than being swept along in its currents, you develop what could be called psychological immunity. Just as physical immunity doesn't prevent exposure to pathogens but metabolizes them effectively, psychological immunity doesn't prevent difficult thoughts but processes them without becoming overwhelmed. This foundational shift in perspective, from being thoughts to having thoughts, creates the internal conditions necessary for true mental resilience. From this vantage point, no thought is inherently problematic because no thought defines you. You are the unchanging awareness in which all thoughts arise and dissolve, like weather patterns in an infinite sky. Chapter 5. The Resilience Paradox. The paradox of true strength reveals itself most powerfully in nature. While mighty oak trees can be uprooted by fierce storms, humble reeds survive by bending with the wind. This fundamental truth extends far beyond botany. It cuts to the heart of mental resilience and reveals why so many attempts to build psychological strength ultimately fail. You've likely experienced the exhaustion that comes from constant resistance, fighting against circumstances you can't control, denying emotions you don't want to feel, struggling to force specific outcomes. This perpetual battle drains your mental resources while paradoxically making you more vulnerable, not less. Like the oak tree that snaps because it cannot bend, psychological rigidity creates brittleness rather than strength. True resilience emerges not from rigid opposition, but from strategic surrender, knowing when to yield and when to stand firm. This isn't about passive resignation or giving up. It's about recognizing that acceptance of what cannot be changed actually increases your power to change what can be. Think of a martial artist who redirects an opponent's force rather than meeting it head-on. The principle is the same. Working with reality rather than against it multiplies your effectiveness while conserving precious mental energy. The distinction between surrendering to reality and surrendering to fear is crucial. When you surrender to fear, you abandon your values and retreat from life's challenges. When you surrender to reality, you accept what is while maintaining full engagement with life. This acceptance creates the psychological space necessary for wise action rather than reactive opposition. Strategic surrender operates across three essential dimensions. First, there's acceptance of unchangeable circumstances, recognizing what truly lies beyond your control versus what you can influence. This doesn't mean you approve of or like these circumstances, only that you stop exhausting yourself fighting against immutable facts. Second comes the acknowledgement of emotions without being controlled by them. Fighting against feelings only intensifies them, while accepting their presence often allows them to move through you more quickly. You can experience anxiety without being ruled by it, feel anger without acting from it, encounter fear without being paralyzed by it. The third dimension involves releasing attachment to specific outcomes while maintaining commitment to your values. This creates tremendous psychological freedom. You can pursue goals with full engagement while remaining resilient when things don't go as planned. Your mind may resist this concept of surrender, interpreting it as weakness or defeat. This resistance is natural but misguided. Consider how much mental energy you currently expend fighting against reality, denying what is, suppressing emotions, demanding specific outcomes. This constant resistance doesn't make you stronger. It depletes the very resources you need for effective action. The practice of yielding strength begins with identifying areas where you're exhausting yourself through unnecessary resistance. Look for situations where you're fighting against unchangeable facts, denying persistent emotions, or becoming rigidly attached to specific outcomes. Then explore how strategic acceptance might create greater power in these situations. This shift transforms your relationship with challenges. Instead of meeting every difficulty with rigid opposition, you develop the wisdom to know when acceptance creates more power than resistance. Like the reed that survives the storm, you maintain core stability while allowing peripheral flexibility. This capacity for strategic surrender becomes particularly valuable during life's inevitable storms. When circumstances exceed your control, when emotions run high, when carefully laid plans fall apart. These are the moments when the ability to yield strategically rather than break under pressure makes all the difference. The key lies in recognizing that acceptance isn't passive. It's a deliberate strategy for conserving and focusing your mental resources. When you stop exhausting yourself fighting against what cannot be changed, you have more energy available for influencing what can be changed. This is the paradox at the heart of true resilience: strength through strategic surrender. What makes this approach so powerful is its sustainability. While rigid resistance eventually depletes you, strategic surrender allows you to maintain engagement with life's challenges indefinitely. You become like the reed that not only survives the storm but emerges more resilient because of it. The wisdom to know when to stand firm and when to bend is not just a practical skill. It's the foundation of lasting mental strength. In a world that often equates strength with rigid opposition, developing this capacity for strategic surrender sets you apart. It allows you to maintain core stability while adapting to changing circumstances, to acknowledge reality without being defeated by it, to conserve mental resources while remaining fully engaged with life's challenges. Chapter 6: The Perspective Shift. Two hikers stand before the same steep mountain trail. In that moment, facing identical circumstances, their experiences could not be more different. One sees an exhausting obstacle that ruins their day, their mind already racing with thoughts of fatigue and regret. The other sees an exhilarating opportunity, their body energized by the challenge ahead. Same trail, same steepness, same physical reality, yet entirely different experiences. This fundamental truth reveals why some people crumble under pressure while others thrive. It's not the circumstances that determine your experience, but how you perceive them. Your mind's interpretation of events shapes your reality more powerfully than the events themselves. You've likely experienced this phenomenon in your own life. The same work presentation that energizes you when you're feeling confident becomes overwhelming when you're doubting yourself. The same feedback that motivates you one day crushes your spirit the next. These dramatic shifts in experience don't come from changes in external reality. They come from shifts in your perspective. Understanding this mechanism is crucial because it reveals an extraordinary opportunity. By deliberately shifting how you view challenges, you can transform your entire experience of life's difficulties. This isn't about positive thinking or denying reality. It's about recognizing that multiple interpretations of the same situation are possible, and some serve you better than others. The neuroscience behind this is fascinating. When you encounter any situation, your brain doesn't simply record it like a camera. It actively constructs meaning based on past experiences, current beliefs, and anticipated futures. This meaning-making process happens so quickly and automatically that it feels like you're seeing reality directly. But you're not. You're seeing your interpretation of reality. This is why the most challenging situations in your life also hold the greatest potential for transformation. When you shift your perspective from seeing challenges as obstacles to viewing them as catalysts, you don't just change your thinking. You literally change your brain's chemistry and thus your entire experience. Enter the catalyst perspective, a revolutionary way of relating to life's challenges that transforms them from sources of suffering into opportunities for growth. This isn't about pretending difficulties don't exist or that pain isn't real. Instead, it's about developing the capacity to see challenges as essential components of your development, rather than obstacles to your happiness. Your natural tendency to perceive difficulties as problems to be eliminated is biologically wired. It's part of your survival programming. But this reactive view, while useful for physical survival, creates unnecessary psychological suffering and prevents you from accessing the growth potential within challenges. The catalyst perspective flips this dynamic entirely. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you learn to ask, "How is this happening for me?" Instead of seeing obstacles as blocking your path, you begin to recognize them as the path itself. This shift doesn't make challenges easier, but it makes them meaningful, and meaning transforms everything. Through the catalyst perspective practice, you develop the ability to consciously choose interpretations that empower rather than diminish you. When facing difficulty, you learn to ask, "What strength might this challenge be developing in me? What capabilities might this situation be calling forth? What opportunities for growth exist here that wouldn't be possible without this challenge?" This isn't about forcing artificial positivity. It's about expanding your perspective to recognize that every challenge contains both difficulty and opportunity. The difficulty is usually obvious. It's what your mind gravitates to automatically. The opportunity becomes visible only when you deliberately shift your perspective. Most importantly, this capacity to reframe challenges isn't just a mental trick. It creates tangible changes in how you experience and respond to difficulties. When you view a challenge as a pure obstacle, your body tenses, your mind narrows, and your resources become limited. When you view that same challenge as a catalyst for growth, your body energizes, your mind opens, and your resources multiply. The power of this shift cannot be overstated. It's the difference between being crushed by pressure and being forged by it, between seeing difficulties as punishments and seeing them as initiations, between experiencing life's challenges as your antagonist and experiencing them as your teacher. Your entire relationship with adversity transforms. What once felt like a heavy burden becomes a source of strength. What seemed like an unfair obstacle reveals itself as precisely what you need to grow. This isn't mere positive thinking or wishful reframing. It's a fundamental revolution in how your mind processes and responds to life's demands. When you make this profound shift, you'll find yourself drawing power from the very experiences that once drained you. Chapter 7. The Response Gap. Between the moment something triggers you and your response lies a space so small it seems non-existent, yet within that microscopic gap exists your greatest opportunity for transformation. Most people live their entire lives without discovering this space, remaining prisoners of their automatic reactions. Yet those who master this gap develop an almost superhuman ability to respond rather than react, even under intense pressure. Think of how many times you said something in anger that you later regretted, made an impulsive decision that undermined your goals, or frozen in a situation that demanded action. In each case, you likely knew better. You had the knowledge and capacity to respond differently. What you lacked wasn't information or intention. It was space. The response gap, that critical moment between stimulus and reaction, determines whether you operate from wisdom or conditioning, choice or compulsion. When this gap collapses, you become a prisoner of automatic patterns, repeating behaviors that undermine your well-being despite your best intentions to act differently. Understanding why this happens requires exploring how your brain processes triggers. When you encounter a challenging situation, your nervous system activates within milliseconds, flooding your body with stress hormones, before your conscious mind can even register what's happening. This lightning-fast response served our ancestors well when facing physical threats. But in modern life, it often creates more problems than it solves. Most resilience training fails because it focuses on what to do rather than when to do it. You can know countless techniques for managing emotions or making wise decisions, but if you can't access them in the critical moment, they remain theoretical rather than practical. The key isn't having better responses, it's creating the space to access them. The response gap operates like a muscle. It can be strengthened through consistent practice. Just as a martial artist trains to maintain clarity under attack, you can develop the capacity to create space, even amid intense emotional triggers. This isn't about slowing down your reactions artificially, it's about developing an internal pause that allows wisdom to enter. The pause practice begins with recognizing your personal triggers, those situations, words, or circumstances that typically collapse your response gap instantly. By studying these patterns outside of triggering moments, you develop the awareness to catch them earlier in the process. The goal isn't to eliminate triggers. That's neither possible nor desirable. Instead, you learn to use triggers as alerts, reminding you to create space rather than react automatically. This practice becomes transformative when you understand that even a microsecond of space changes everything. In that tiny gap between stimulus and response, you can access all your wisdom, experience, and intention. Without that gap, you're operating on autopilot, repeating patterns regardless of their effectiveness. The most challenging aspect of developing this capacity is remembering to pause when you're triggered. Your nervous system is designed to bypass conscious thought in threatening situations, making it feel impossible to create space in precisely the moments you need it most. This is why the practice must begin with smaller triggers, gradually building your capacity to maintain presence under greater pressure. Physical anchors prove invaluable here. Simple sensations that remind you to pause. Feeling your feet on the ground, noticing your breath, or registering the temperature of the air can interrupt automatic reactions just long enough to create choice. These aren't relaxation techniques. They're pattern interrupts that create crucial moments of space. Through consistent practice, you begin noticing subtle signals before full triggering occurs. This early warning system expands your response gap naturally, giving you more time to choose rather than react. You develop what might be called trigger wisdom, the ability to use challenging situations as opportunities to pause rather than letting them collapse your capacity for conscious response. The real power of the response gap reveals itself in relationships, where automatic reactions often create unnecessary suffering. When you can pause before responding to criticism, disagreement, or emotional intensity, you access choices that transform potential conflicts into opportunities for deeper connection. This same principle applies to decision-making, where the ability to create space between impulse and action often determines the quality of your choices. This is more than stress management or emotional regulation. It's about fundamental freedom. Every time you create space between stimulus and response, you strengthen your capacity for conscious choice rather than conditioned reaction. This is where the bulletproof mindset truly begins to form, not in having perfect responses, but in having the space to choose them. Chapter 8. Emotional Alchemy. Your triggers aren't problems to be eliminated. They're opportunities waiting to be transformed. Just as a master blacksmith uses intense heat not to destroy metal but to reshape it into something stronger and more valuable, your emotional triggers contain within them the raw material for profound transformation. Consider how you currently experience emotional triggers. Those moments when something or someone activates an intense emotional response that seems to bypass your rational mind completely. In these moments, you likely feel overwhelmed, hijacked by emotions that feel too powerful to control. The natural instinct is to either fight against these feelings or try to escape them entirely. But both approaches miss the extraordinary opportunity hidden within these challenging experiences. What makes emotional triggers so potent isn't just their intensity, it's their precision. Each trigger points directly to an area of your psyche that's calling for attention and transformation. When you feel disproportionately hurt by criticism, that trigger is illuminating a deeper pattern around self-worth. When uncertainty creates overwhelming anxiety, that trigger is highlighting an opportunity to develop genuine trust in your capacity to handle the unknown. The process of trigger transmutation begins with a fundamental shift in orientation. Instead of seeing triggers as threats to your stability, you learn to recognize them as precise feedback mechanisms, revealing exactly where your next growth opportunity lies. This isn't about positive thinking or denying the real discomfort these moments create. Rather, it's about engaging with triggers in a way that extracts their transformative potential. The conventional approaches to handling triggers typically fall into two categories: suppression or expression. Suppression attempts to shut down or control emotional responses, while expression encourages releasing emotions without restraint. Both miss the mark because neither approach actually transforms the underlying pattern. Suppression merely buries the trigger deeper, while unrestrained expression often reinforces reactive patterns. Trigger transmutation offers a different path. Instead of fighting against emotional intensity or being consumed by it, you learn to use that very energy as fuel for transformation. This requires developing a new relationship with triggering experiences, one where you remain present with the discomfort while maintaining enough internal space to respond rather than react. When you understand that triggers point directly to areas calling for growth, you stop seeing them as interruptions to your well-being and start recognizing them as precise guides for your development. The very intensity that makes triggers so challenging also makes them powerful catalysts for change when engaged skillfully. The practice of trigger transmutation involves three key elements. First, you learn to recognize triggers as they arise, catching them early before they completely overwhelm your system. This requires developing a subtle awareness of your body's early warning signals, the slight tension, the shift in breathing, the first hint of emotional activation. Second, you identify the underlying vulnerability being activated. Every trigger connects to a core belief or unmet need. Rather than getting lost in the surface story of what triggered you, you learn to ask, what deeper pattern is this trigger illuminating? What underlying belief or fear is being activated? Third, you respond to the core need rather than reacting to the surface trigger. This is where real transformation occurs. Instead of fighting against the emotional activation or trying to make it go away, you engage with the deeper pattern it reveals. This might mean offering yourself the validation you're seeking from others, developing the inner security that external uncertainty threatens, or building the self-trust that criticism seems to undermine. Through this process, triggers that once seemed like your greatest enemies become your most powerful teachers. Each triggering situation becomes an opportunity to transform old patterns into new capabilities. The very experiences that used to destabilize you become catalysts for developing deeper resilience. This capacity to transmute triggers into opportunities represents a fundamental shift in how you relate to emotional intensity. Instead of being at the mercy of your triggers, you develop the ability to engage with them in a way that consistently strengthens rather than destabilizes you. Your triggers aren't random or meaningless. They're precise feedback mechanisms pointing exactly where your next level of growth awaits. When you learn to engage with them skillfully, you don't just cope better with challenging situations. You transform them into opportunities for unprecedented growth. Chapter 9. The Decision Point. At every moment you stand at a crossroads, not a physical intersection, but a psychological decision point that determines whether you'll be driven by unconscious reaction or guided by conscious response. This critical juncture exists in the space between what happens to you and what you do next. While this moment may seem infinitesimal, it contains within it the seed of true psychological freedom. You've experienced these decision points countless times, when someone criticizes your work, when plans fall apart, when faced with unexpected challenges. In these moments, your nervous system instantly prepares for one of three default responses: fight, flight, or freeze. Your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, and your mind narrows its focus to perceived threats. This biological programming served our ancestors well when facing physical dangers. But in modern life, these automatic reactions often create more problems than they solve. The circuitry of reaction runs deep in your neural architecture. When triggered, your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, activates within milliseconds, flooding your system with stress hormones before your conscious mind can even process what's happening. This explains why you often find yourself engaged in reactive behavior before you've had time to consider alternatives. You snap at someone, withdraw from an important conversation, or become paralyzed with indecision, all while a wiser part of you watches helplessly. But here's what changes everything. These reactions only seem automatic because you haven't yet learned to recognize the decision point, that crucial moment when conscious choice becomes possible. This isn't about eliminating emotional reactions, which is neither possible nor desirable. Instead, it's about expanding your awareness of the space between stimulus and response, where real choice exists. When you understand the neuroscience of reaction versus response, you begin to see why most attempts at behavioral change fail. Trying to force yourself to respond differently without first recognizing decision points is like trying to change direction without first noticing you're moving. The key isn't having perfect responses. It's developing the awareness to recognize these critical moments before they pass. Consider how your default reactions manifest. Fight shows up as argumentativeness, defensiveness, or the need to prove yourself right. Flight appears as avoidance, procrastination, or emotional withdrawal. Freeze manifests as paralysis, indecision, or mental blankness. Each pattern served a protective purpose in your past, but now limits your ability to respond effectively to present challenges. The path to expanded response capacity begins with understanding that these reactions aren't personal failings. They're unconscious programs running on autopilot. Just as a computer can be reprogrammed, your response patterns can be updated once you recognize the moment of choice. This recognition creates space for what we call response expansion, the ability to access multiple response options rather than defaulting to habitual reactions. What makes this approach transformative is that it works with your brain's natural functioning rather than against it. Instead of trying to force new behaviors, you learn to recognize decision points, those moments when your system prepares for automatic reaction. This awareness itself begins to dissolve the compulsive nature of reactivity. The neural pathways of reaction are like deep grooves in your brain created through repeated use. While you can't eliminate these pathways, you can create new ones through conscious attention to decision points. Each time you notice the moment of choice, you're literally rewiring your brain's response patterns, creating new neural pathways that support conscious response over automatic reaction. This isn't about perfect execution. It's about expanding your window of awareness at crucial moments. Even recognizing that you reacted automatically after the fact builds the awareness necessary for future recognition of decision points. Each moment of recognition strengthens your capacity to catch these critical junctures earlier in the process. The true power of decision point awareness lies in its cumulative effect. While individual moments of conscious choice might seem small, they gradually reshape your entire relationship with challenging situations. Instead of being driven by unconscious reactions, you develop the capacity to respond from wisdom and choice. You cannot control what happens to you, but you always have a choice about how you respond. This truth becomes reality when you learn to recognize and expand your decision points. The journey from reaction to response begins with this fundamental shift in awareness. Chapter 10. The Bulletproof Question. Your internal dialogue shapes your reality more powerfully than any external circumstance. Just as a skilled interrogator can unlock a case with the right questions, the quality of your self-directed inquiries determines the depth and breadth of your mental possibilities. When you find yourself trapped in cycles of anxiety, self-doubt, or limitation, it's rarely the situation itself creating the suffering. It's the questions you're unconsciously asking about it. Most people's internal questioning patterns unconsciously reinforce vulnerability rather than resilience. Questions like, "Why does this always happen to me?" Or, "What if I'm not good enough?" create psychological contraction, narrowing your perceived options and amplifying emotional distress. These disempowering questions activate neural pathways associated with threat and limitation, essentially programming your brain to find evidence supporting your worst fears. The revolutionary concept of bulletproof questions offers a different pathway. These intentionally designed inquiries generate insights, possibilities, and agency rather than limitations, problems, and victimhood. When you shift from "what's wrong with me" to "what's trying to emerge here", зрение, вы активизируете полностью разные нейронные сети, те, которые связаны с творчеством, решением и ростом. The brain's question processing mechanisms operate like search engines. They will find answers to whatever you ask, regardless of whether those questions serve or sabotage you. Understanding this mechanism reveals why positive thinking often fails, while question transformation succeeds. Trying to force positive answers to disempowering questions is like trying to build a stable structure on a crumbling foundation. Three fundamental dimensions determine a question's impact on your psychological state. Time orientation examines whether your questions fixate on past events or explore future possibilities. Agency orientation reveals whether your inquiries position you as a victim of circumstances or a creator of outcomes. Possibility orientation determines whether your questions focus on constraints or opportunities. Most limiting questions operate below conscious awareness, running as background processes that shape your experience without your recognition. These habitual inquiries form deep neural pathways, making them feel natural and true rather than what they actually are. Learned patterns that can be transformed. The question redirect practice provides a concrete method for transforming limiting questions into expansive ones. Rather than trying to silence the limiting question, which often strengthens it, you learn to redirect its energy toward more empowering inquiries. A question like, "Why can't I handle this?" becomes, "What resources haven't I accessed yet? What's wrong with this situation?" transforms into, "What possibilities does this situation contain?" This redirection creates immediate shifts in your psychological state, because the brain cannot simultaneously process disempowering and empowering questions. Just as your eyes cannot focus on two different points at the same time, your mind cannot maintain contradictory questioning patterns. The one you consciously choose will override the habitual default. The power of this transformation extends beyond immediate emotional relief. As you consistently redirect limiting questions toward expensive ones, you literally rewire your brain's default questioning patterns. What begins as a conscious practice gradually becomes your natural way of processing experience. Most significantly, bulletproof questions don't deny reality or suppress legitimate concerns. Instead, they create a mental environment where challenges become catalysts for growth rather than sources of contraction. They maintain a fierce commitment to truth, while ensuring that truth serves rather than sabotages your development. This mastery of internal dialogue represents one of the most direct paths to psychological resilience. When you can transform the questions that arise in your mind, you gain the power to redirect your mental and emotional experience at will. You develop the capacity to maintain perspective and access resources even amid significant challenges. Remember, the quality of your life is determined by the quality of the questions you habitually ask yourself. This truth becomes your foundation for developing an unshakable yet flexible identity. The next crucial element in building your bulletproof mindset. Chapter 11. The Identity Anchor. Your sense of self forms the bedrock of psychological resilience. Just as a ship requires a sturdy anchor to maintain stability during violent storms, you need a grounded identity to navigate life's turbulent waters without being swept away. This isn't about becoming rigid or unchanging. It's about developing a core stability that allows for flexibility without fragmentation. When major life changes strike, whether career transitions, relationship endings, or health challenges, your familiar sense of self often feels threatened. The roles, relationships, and achievements you've used to define yourself may suddenly shift or disappear entirely. Without a deeper anchor, these external changes can create profound internal instability. Most people unconsciously build their identity on unstable foundations. They define themselves primarily through their professional role. I'm a successful executive. Their relationships, I'm a devoted parent. Or their achievements, I'm an award winner. While these aspects of life certainly contribute to your experience, treating them as the core of your identity creates inevitable vulnerability. Consider how this plays out in real life. When you anchor your identity in your professional role, a job loss or career transition can trigger an existential crisis. When you define yourself through relationships, a breakup or loss can shatter your sense of self. When you build your identity around achievements, temporary failures or setbacks can devastate your self-worth. The transformative concept of the identity anchor offers a different approach. Rather than deriving your sense of self from changeable external circumstances, you learn to connect with deeper aspects of identity that remain stable regardless of what's happening around you. This creates psychological resilience that doesn't depend on controlling or maintaining specific life conditions. Understanding how identity forms and evolves reveals why external anchors create fragility, while internal anchors build strength. Your brain naturally seeks to create a coherent sense of self, but it often latches onto visible, socially reinforced aspects of identity rather than deeper, more stable elements. Society constantly reinforces this tendency, measuring worth through status, relationships, and accomplishments, rather than core values and authentic self-expression. The three most common identity traps create specific forms of vulnerability. Role-based identity makes your sense of self dependent on maintaining particular positions or functions. Relationship-based identity ties your worth to others' presence and approval. Achievement-based identity requires constant success to maintain basic self-worth. While these sources of identity aren't inherently problematic, treating them as the foundation of your self-concept creates psychological fragility. The key lies in recognizing them as expressions of identity rather than its essence. Your roles can change while your core values remain stable. Relationships can shift while your capacity for connection endures. Achievements can vary while your commitment to growth continues. The core anchor practice helps you identify and connect with aspects of self that transcend circumstantial change. Rather than attempting to eliminate external identities, you learn to root them in deeper soil. This creates a psychological structure that bends without breaking, adapts without losing center, and grows without requiring constant external validation. This shift transforms how you experience life's inevitable changes. When your identity has deeper roots, professional transitions become opportunities for growth rather than existential threats. Relationship changes, while still emotionally significant, don't shatter your basic sense of self. Temporary setbacks are seen as feedback rather than fatal blows to your worth. Many resist this shift, fearing that releasing achievement-based identity will undermine motivation, or that loosening role-based identity will lead to irresponsibility. Yet experience shows the opposite. When you connect with deeper aspects of self, motivation becomes more sustainable and responsibility more authentic. You act from internal conviction rather than external pressure. A truly bulletproof mindset requires this balance of stability and flexibility in your self-concept. You must be sufficiently grounded to maintain coherence amid change, yet sufficiently flexible to adapt and grow. This creates psychological resilience that doesn't depend on controlling external circumstances, but rather on maintaining connection with your core self. You are not what happens to you. You are the awareness that experiences what happens. This fundamental truth, when deeply understood, transforms your relationship with all of life's changes. You remain anchored not in what you do, have, or achieve, but in who you fundamentally are. This shift in identity frees you from the exhausting cycle of defining yourself through external markers of success or status. When difficulties arise, you no longer experience them as personal attacks on your worth, but as temporary conditions moving through your field of awareness, like a vast sky that remains unchanged while storms pass beneath it. Your essential nature persists undisturbed by life's inevitable turbulence. Chapter 12. The Meaning Revolution. The meaning you assign to events shapes your experience more profoundly than the events themselves. While you cannot control everything that happens to you, you possess the remarkable power to control what those happenings mean. This fundamental truth becomes evident when you observe how different people, or even yourself at different times, can experience identical circumstances in radically different ways. Your brain is constantly generating meanings and interpretations, operating like a meaning-making machine that never stops running. This automatic process occurs largely outside your conscious awareness, creating stories about what events mean about you, your life, and your future. Most people don't realize they're actively creating these meanings, rather than passively discovering them. They believe they're simply seeing reality as it is. However, neuroscience reveals that your brain constructs meaning through complex networks of association, memory, and prediction. When something happens, your neural circuits immediately begin searching for similar past experiences and potential future implications, creating an interpretation that feels like objective reality, but is actually a subjective construction. Understanding this meaning-making process gives you unprecedented power over your psychological experience. While you cannot stop your brain from generating interpretations, you can learn to direct this process consciously rather than letting it run on autopilot. The three dimensions of meaning profoundly impact your experience: personal significance, time orientation, and scope. Personal significance determines whether you interpret events as defining statements about your identity, or simply informative experiences that you can learn from. Time orientation influences whether you view challenging situations as permanent conditions or temporary circumstances. Scope determines whether you see events as affecting your entire life or just specific aspects of it. These dimensions operate automatically unless you consciously intervene. When something challenging occurs, your brain typically defaults to interpretations that are personal. This means something about me. Permanent. This will always be this way. And pervasive. This affects everything. This pattern creates unnecessary suffering and undermines resilience. However, by developing meaning control, the capacity to consciously assign empowering meanings to challenging events, you can transform how you experience difficulties. This doesn't mean denying reality or pretending everything is positive. Instead, it means choosing interpretations that empower rather than diminish you while remaining grounded in truth. The process begins with recognizing that you're constantly assigning meanings rather than discovering them. This awareness creates space between events and their interpretation, allowing you to examine and redirect automatic meaning-making patterns. By questioning default interpretations and consciously choosing more empowering alternatives, you develop the ability to transform your experience without changing external circumstances. This capacity for meaning control becomes particularly powerful during challenges and setbacks. Instead of automatically interpreting failure as evidence of inadequacy, you can choose to view it as valuable feedback. Rather than seeing rejection as proof of unworthiness, you can interpret it as redirection toward better opportunities. When facing uncertainty, instead of reading it as a threat, you can choose to see it as an opening for new possibilities. Your brain will always generate meanings automatically. This is how it's designed to function. But by developing awareness of this process and learning to direct it consciously, you gain unprecedented control over your psychological experience. The events themselves may be beyond your control, but their meaning remains firmly within your power to shape. The path to psychological resilience runs directly through your capacity to control meaning. When you master this ability, external circumstances lose their power to determine your internal state. You develop the freedom to choose interpretations that serve rather than sabotage you, transforming your relationship with life's inevitable challenges. Life will continue presenting difficulties. This is part of the human experience. But by consciously choosing how you interpret these events, you develop the ability to transform potential sources of suffering into catalysts for growth. This isn't about positive thinking or denial. It's about taking control of the meaning-making process that determines how you experience reality. Every obstacle that appears in your path carries within it the seeds of opportunity, waiting to be uncovered by a mind trained to see beyond surface appearances. Your power lies not in changing what life throws at you, but in transforming how those experiences shape your inner world. When you grasp this fundamental truth, you move from being a passive recipient of circumstances to an active creator of your psychological reality. Remember, life is not what happens to you, but what you make happen inside you because of what happens. This profound truth opens the door to unprecedented psychological freedom and resilience. Chapter 13: The Courage Threshold. From the moment you wake up each morning to the time you rest your head at night, your comfort zone exerts a powerful influence on every decision you make. This invisible boundary between what feels safe and what creates growth shapes your choices, your relationships, and ultimately, your destiny. Most people understand intellectually that growth requires stepping beyond comfort. Yet this knowledge alone rarely overcomes the profound psychological resistance that arises at this threshold. Your brain, designed primarily for survival rather than fulfillment, naturally gravitates toward the familiar. This safety-seeking mechanism served our ancestors well when daily survival was uncertain, but in today's world, it often holds you back from the very experiences that would foster your development. The comfort zone, while necessary for rest and integration, becomes a psychological prison when never expanded. Consider how a muscle responds to challenges. When never stressed, it gradually weakens and atrophies. When overwhelmed with excessive strain, it risks injury and breakdown. But when exposed to optimal resistance, just beyond its current capacity, it adapts and grows stronger. Your psychological resilience follows the same principle. Avoiding all discomfort leads to increasing fragility, while excessive challenge creates burnout. The key lies in identifying your growth zone, that sweet spot just beyond comfort where optimal development occurs. This growth zone isn't fixed. It expands as you develop greater capacity. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable, and what felt impossible becomes achievable. But this expansion never happens automatically. It requires deliberate engagement with calculated challenges that push your boundaries without overwhelming your resources. The resistance you feel at the edge of comfort isn't a warning to retreat. It's a signal that you're approaching territory rich with potential for growth. This resistance manifests in many forms: physical tension, emotional unease, mental chatter about potential risks or failures. Understanding these sensations as natural responses rather than danger signals transforms how you relate to them. Your optimal growth zone lies beyond comfort but before overwhelming stress. This territory is marked by productive discomfort, the kind that stretches your capabilities while remaining within your capacity to integrate and learn from the experience. Learning to distinguish between productive discomfort and destructive distress becomes crucial for sustainable growth. The paradox of psychological development is that avoiding discomfort actually increases your vulnerability to life's inevitable challenges. Each time you retreat from a beneficial challenge, you reinforce the pattern of avoidance and shrink your comfort zone further. Conversely, each time you mindfully engage with optimal challenges, you expand your capacity and strengthen your resilience. The fear that arises at the comfort zone boundary isn't your enemy. It's a natural response to perceived uncertainty. Rather than fighting this fear or trying to eliminate it, you can learn to move forward with it, understanding that its presence doesn't indicate danger but opportunity. This shift in relationship with fear transforms it from a barrier into a compass pointing toward growth. Success in expanding your comfort zone isn't measured by the absence of fear, but by your capacity to move forward despite it. Every time you take action while feeling uncertainty, you're literally rewiring your brain's threat response system, building neural pathways that associate challenge with opportunity rather than danger. The most resilient individuals aren't those who feel no fear. They're those who have learned to use the energy of fear as fuel for growth. They understand that the sensation of standing at the edge of comfort, feeling that magnetic pull between safety and expansion, is precisely where the most valuable opportunities for development exist. This edge, the boundary between what you can currently handle with ease and what stretches your capabilities, is your primary training ground for developing a bulletproof mindset. Every deliberate step beyond this edge, when taken with awareness and strategic intent, strengthens your psychological immune system and expands your capacity to handle future challenges. Much like a muscle that grows stronger through progressive overload, your mind develops resilience through calculated exposure to discomfort. Each time you willingly step into uncertainty, you're not just facing a single challenge. You're reprogramming your entire response to adversity. The edge becomes less threatening, more familiar, until what once seemed impossibly daunting transforms into your new baseline of capability. This transformation occurs at a fundamental level, rewiring your instinctive reactions to discomfort. You begin to recognize these moments of uncertainty, not as warnings to retreat, but as invitations to expand. The very sensations that once triggered avoidance become reliable signals that you're on the path of growth, much like an athlete learns to welcome the burn of intense training rather than fear it. Chapter 14. The Adversity Advantage. Just as a skilled farmer understands that deliberately stressing certain plants triggers rapid growth and increased resilience, life's challenges contain hidden opportunities for accelerated psychological development. This truth remains counterintuitive because your brain naturally categorizes all stress as threatening, missing the crucial distinction between destructive adversity that diminishes you and constructive adversity that strengthens you. When facing difficult circumstances, you likely focus on getting through them as quickly as possible, viewing challenges solely as obstacles between you and your goals. This survival-oriented mindset, while natural, prevents you from accessing the unique growth opportunities that only adversity can provide. The most resilient individuals understand that properly processed difficulty serves as a catalyst for exceptional development, creating possibilities for growth unavailable through any other means. Current research in post-traumatic growth reveals a fascinating pattern. When faced with similar challenges, some people emerge devastated while others transform the same circumstances into fuel for unprecedented development. This difference doesn't stem from the intensity of the adversity, but from how it's processed and leveraged. Those who develop extraordinary resilience have learned to extract maximum growth value from difficult experiences rather than merely enduring them. The key lies in understanding that not all adversity is created equal. Destructive adversity, challenges that exceed your current capacity to process or integrate, should indeed be avoided or minimized when possible. But constructive adversity, difficulties that stretch your capabilities while remaining within your capacity to learn from them, contains unprecedented potential for accelerated growth. This distinction becomes crucial because it determines whether you should persist through a challenge or pivot away from it. Destructive adversity creates trauma when you lack the resources or support to process it effectively. Constructive adversity, while uncomfortable, strengthens your psychological immune system when approached with the right mindset and methods. The challenge lies in maintaining this growth perspective during intense difficulties. When you're in the midst of adversity, your brain's survival mechanisms naturally focus on escape rather than opportunity. This reactive pattern, while designed to protect you, often prevents you from accessing the transformative potential within challenging experiences. Consider how physical training works. Muscles develop not during periods of rest, but in response to optimal stress followed by recovery. Similarly, psychological resilience develops most rapidly when you deliberately engage with challenges rather than avoiding them. This doesn't mean seeking out hardship, but rather learning to extract maximum value from the difficulties you inevitably face. Your relationship with adversity fundamentally determines your capacity for growth. Those who approach challenges with a survival mentality, focusing solely on getting through them, miss the unique developmental opportunities these experiences provide. But when you shift to a growth mentality, every difficulty becomes a potential catalyst for exceptional development. This shift requires moving beyond the basic question, how do I get through this, to the more powerful inquiry, how do I grow through this? This change in orientation transforms your relationship with challenge from one of mere endurance to one of deliberate engagement. Rather than being consumed by adversity, you learn to maintain psychological space around it, allowing you to process difficulties more effectively while extracting their growth potential. The most resilient individuals understand that comfort, while pleasant, never creates exceptional capacity. They recognize that their greatest developments often emerge not from their moments of ease, but from their encounters with significant challenges. This doesn't mean they enjoy difficulty more than others, but rather that they've learned to leverage it more effectively. When you begin viewing adversity as a catalyst rather than merely an obstacle, you access an accelerated path to psychological development. This perspective shift doesn't make challenges easier, but it makes them more valuable, transforming what could be merely endured into what can be actively leveraged for unprecedented growth. Think of adversity as a form of resistance training for your mind. Just as physical strength requires progressive overload, psychological resilience develops through calculated exposure to challenge. Each difficulty you face becomes an opportunity to strengthen your mental immune system, developing capabilities that remain inaccessible to those who prioritize comfort over growth. The goal isn't to seek out suffering, but to extract maximum value from the challenges you inevitably encounter. This requires maintaining a delicate balance, caring deeply about outcomes while remaining unattached to specific results. This paradoxical relationship with experience allows you to fully engage with challenges while maintaining the psychological freedom necessary for growth. Through this lens, difficulty becomes more than something to overcome. It becomes essential fuel for exceptional development. Those who develop bulletproof mindsets understand that their capacity to leverage adversity ultimately determines their rate of psychological growth. They recognize that while comfort might feel better in the moment, properly processed challenges create possibilities unavailable through any other means. Chapter 15: The Strategic Detachment. Through my extensive work with high-performing individuals across fields, I've discovered that true psychological strength emerges not from caring less, but from caring differently. You already understand the importance of commitment and dedication, but there's a subtle yet crucial distinction between caring deeply and being attached that can transform your entire relationship with outcomes. Consider how a surgeon must operate with complete dedication to patient outcomes while maintaining enough emotional distance to function effectively when complications arise. This same principle applies to every area where you seek to perform at your highest level while maintaining psychological stability. You've likely experienced the pain of caring so intensely about an outcome that you become emotionally hijacked when things don't go as planned. Despite giving your absolute best effort, when preferred results don't materialize, the disappointment can be crushing. This intense attachment to specific outcomes creates a form of psychological vulnerability that actually undermines your effectiveness while increasing your suffering. The solution isn't to care less, it's to care differently. Strategic detachment allows you to invest fully in what matters while releasing the psychological need for particular results. This isn't about becoming cold or indifferent. Rather, it's about maintaining the emotional stability that allows you to perform at your peak regardless of circumstances. When you're attached to outcomes, your effectiveness actually decreases. Attachment creates tension, anxiety, and a desperate need to control what often cannot be controlled. This psychological state impairs decision-making and depletes the mental resources needed for optimal performance. Strategic detachment, by contrast, creates the mental space needed for clarity, creativity, and wise action. When you release attachment while maintaining complete care and commitment, you access a state of engaged equanimity that enhances rather than diminishes your effectiveness. There are three crucial dimensions to mastering strategic detachment. Emotional detachment allows you to experience emotions fully without being controlled by them. You don't suppress feelings, but neither do you become hijacked by them. Like a scientist who can be fascinated by their observations without being overwhelmed by them, you maintain enough psychological distance to respond rather than react. Outcome detachment shifts focus from specific results to process excellence. While you maintain clear goals and preferences, your sense of success comes from giving your absolute best rather than achieving particular outcomes. This creates resilience in the face of setbacks while paradoxically increasing your likelihood of achieving desired results. Identity detachment separates your sense of self-worth from achievement. While you maintain high standards and ambitious goals, you don't stake your value as a person on specific outcomes. This creates the psychological safety needed to take bold action without fear of ego devastation if things don't go as planned. Most people initially resist strategic detachment because they confuse it with indifference or lack of commitment. The opposite is true. Releasing attachment while maintaining complete care actually strengthens commitment by making it more sustainable and effective. When you're attached, your commitment is contaminated by psychological neediness that creates tension and reduces effectiveness. When you release attachment while maintaining care, you access a state of relaxed excellence that enhances performance while protecting psychological stability. The key is learning to care completely while holding lightly. This means investing your full energy, attention, and effort while releasing the desperate need for things to unfold in particular ways. You maintain clear preferences while accepting that outcomes aren't always within your control. This capacity for engaged detachment is what allows those with bulletproof mindsets to take bold action without being devastated by setbacks. They understand that attachment creates suffering, while strategic detachment creates both effectiveness and resilience. The practice begins with recognizing where attachment creates unnecessary suffering in your life. Notice areas where caring has become contaminated by psychological neediness, where your emotional stability depends on particular outcomes. Then begin experimenting with releasing attachment while maintaining complete care and commitment. Start with small situations where the stakes feel manageable. Notice how releasing attachment while maintaining care actually increases your effectiveness while reducing suffering. As you build confidence in this approach, gradually apply it to higher stakes situations. The goal isn't to stop caring or become indifferent. Rather, it's to care in a way that enhances rather than diminishes your effectiveness while protecting your psychological stability. This is the art of caring deeply without attachment, a foundational skill for developing a truly bulletproof mindset. Chapter 16. The Resilience Reserve. Just as a reservoir collects water during abundance to sustain a city through drought, your psychological resilience requires strategic collection and maintenance of internal resources to weather life's inevitable challenges. Without this deliberate practice of building reserves, even the strongest mind will eventually deplete under sustained pressure. You've likely experienced the gradual erosion of your resilience when pushing relentlessly forward without adequate recovery. Perhaps you've noticed your patience wearing thin, your creativity diminishing, or your emotional stability becoming increasingly fragile. These are not signs of weakness. They are your system's intelligent warning signals that your psychological reserves are running low. Most approaches to building mental toughness focus exclusively on handling difficulty, neglecting the equally crucial practice of replenishment during periods of relative ease. This creates a fundamental vulnerability, like trying to run a marathon while progressively dehydrating. True resilience requires not just effective response to challenges, but strategic recovery between them. Your resilience reservoir consists of interconnected resources that must be deliberately maintained. Physical energy that fuels mental performance, emotional reserves that enable stable responses, mental clarity that allows wise decisions, and spiritual connection that provides sustained meaning. When any of these dimensions depletes, your overall resilience becomes compromised. The physical dimension forms your energetic foundation. Just as a car cannot run without fuel, your mind cannot maintain resilience without adequate physical energy. This requires not just sleep, but strategic renewal throughout your day. Small moments of physical reset, conscious breathing, movement, hydration, create cumulative replenishment that prevents larger depletion. Your emotional dimension determines response stability. Without adequate emotional reserves, even minor triggers can create major reactions. Building these reserves requires deliberately cultivating positive emotions during periods of relative ease, rather than waiting until you're already depleted. This isn't about forced positivity, but strategic, emotional replenishment. The mental dimension governs your capacity for clarity and wise decision-making. Your attention is a finite resource that depletes with sustained focus. Without adequate mental recovery, your cognitive resources deteriorate, leading to impaired judgment exactly when you need it most. Strategic mental breaks, moments of genuine disengagement from intense focus, restore this crucial capacity. Your spiritual dimension provides the meaning and purpose that make resilience worthwhile. Without connection to what truly matters, even perfect physical and mental recovery won't create sustained resilience. This requires regular reconnection with your deepest values and sense of purpose, especially during periods of relative ease when clarity is more accessible. Modern culture often glorifies constant productivity, treating rest as an indulgence rather than a necessity. You may have internalized this perspective, feeling guilty about taking recovery time or believing that relentless push is the only path to success. This creates a destructive pattern where you push until breakdown, take minimal recovery, then repeat the cycle, gradually eroding your baseline resilience. The solution isn't working harder, but working aligned with your system's natural rhythms of expenditure and recovery. Just as elite athletes build strategic recovery into their training to enhance performance, you must build strategic recovery into your life to maintain psychological resilience. The key is shifting from reactive to proactive recovery. Not waiting until you're depleted to restore resources, but deliberately building reserves during periods of relative ease. This requires recognizing that recovery isn't a sign of weakness, but a crucial investment in sustained resilience. Your resilience reservoir must be maintained through regular deposits, small moments of renewal that prevent larger depletion. These aren't indulgences, but necessary investments in your capacity to handle life's challenges effectively. Just as a financial investor makes regular deposits rather than waiting for emergency withdrawals, you must make regular deposits into your resilience reserves. Think of your resilience like a muscle that requires constant conditioning, not just crisis intervention. You wouldn't wait until you're in the middle of a marathon to start training. Yet many people approach psychological resilience exactly this way, waiting until they're already overwhelmed to think about recovery. The key is shifting from reactive to proactive recovery, not waiting until you're depleted to restore resources, but deliberately building reserves during periods of relative ease. This requires recognizing that recovery isn't a sign of weakness, but a crucial investment in sustained resilience. Your resilience reservoir must be maintained through regular deposits, small moments of renewal that prevent larger depletion. These aren't indulgences, but necessary investments in your capacity to handle life's challenges effectively. Just as a financial investor makes regular deposits rather than waiting for emergency withdrawals, you must make regular deposits into your resilience reserves. When you build this habit of proactive resilience, you transform your relationship with stress entirely. Instead of constantly operating at your limits, you maintain a buffer that allows you to respond to challenges from a position of strength. This isn't about avoiding stress. It's about creating a foundation so solid that stress becomes a catalyst for growth rather than a trigger for breakdown. Chapter 17. The Wisdom Filter. Just as a skilled gatekeeper carefully evaluates what enters a kingdom's walls, your mind requires the same level of discerning protection. Think of your mental energy as a precious, finite resource, one that determines the quality of your decisions, the depth of your relationships, and your capacity to handle life's genuine challenges. You've likely experienced the exhaustion that comes from giving equal mental energy to every situation that demands your attention. Your psychological resources scatter in countless directions, rehashing past conversations, worrying about hypothetical futures, or fixating on circumstances beyond your control. This indiscriminate allocation of mental energy leaves you depleted when facing situations that truly warrant your full attention. Most approaches to mental energy management fail because they focus on adding more, rather than allocating wisely what you already have. This misses the fundamental truth. Your psychological resources are finite, and every bit of mental energy directed toward what doesn't matter is unavailable for what does. At the heart of mental energy allocation lies the wisdom filter, your capacity to discern between what deserves your psychological investment and what doesn't. This isn't about ignoring problems or practicing toxic positivity. Rather, it's about developing the discernment to direct your mental resources toward what matters most, rather than what demands attention most loudly. Your focus literally shapes your reality. When you direct mental energy toward problems, your mind expands those problems. When you direct it toward solutions, opportunities multiply. This makes the development of your wisdom filter perhaps the most crucial resilience skill you can develop. The wisdom filter operates through three essential dimensions. First is time perspective, the ability to distinguish between momentary inconveniences and genuine problems. Most situations that consume mental energy are temporary disturbances that will resolve themselves without your psychological investment. Second is impact assessment, evaluating potential consequences rather than immediate irritation. Your mind naturally gravitates toward what irritates you now, rather than what matters in the longer term. The wisdom filter helps you allocate mental energy based on genuine impact rather than immediate discomfort. Third is agency focus, determining whether you have meaningful influence over the situation. Much mental energy is wasted on circumstances beyond your control, leaving you depleted when facing challenges where your actions could make a difference. You might notice resistance to implementing the wisdom filter, particularly in triggering situations. This is natural. Your brain evolved to focus on problems as a survival mechanism. But in today's world, this tendency often creates unnecessary suffering while depleting valuable psychological resources. The energy allocation practice helps you become more intentional about where you invest mental resources. Instead of allowing your attention to be pulled by every passing stimulus, you develop the capacity to pause and ask, "Does this deserve my mental energy? Will investing psychological resources here serve my highest good?" This practice reveals how much mental energy you've been giving to situations that don't warrant it, replaying conversations that can't be changed, worrying about outcomes you can't control, or fixating on minor irritations that won't matter tomorrow. As you implement the wisdom filter, you'll notice greater calm and clarity, with more psychological resources available for what truly matters. Common obstacles include the impulse to ruminate on problems, the fear that not giving something mental energy means not caring, and the habit of reacting to every stimulus that demands attention. The key is recognizing that mental energy directed toward what you can't influence isn't just wasteful. It actively depletes your capacity to handle what you can affect. When you direct your psychological resources with wisdom and intention, you create the foundation for extraordinary impact in the world. Rather than dispersing your mental energy across every passing concern, you conserve and channel it toward what truly deserves your attention. This isn't just about personal peace. It's about maximizing your capacity to create meaningful change where it matters most. Remember, what you focus on grows. Choose wisely. Your mental energy is a precious resource that, when properly conserved and directed, becomes the foundation for extraordinary resilience and meaningful impact in the world. Chapter 18. The Impact Paradox. When you imagine true freedom, what comes to mind? Perhaps you envision a life free from obligations, responsibilities, and demands, where nothing weighs on your shoulders and every moment belongs solely to you. Yet this common vision of freedom through the absence of responsibility creates a peculiar paradox. Those who pursue it often find themselves more psychologically constrained, not less. Consider how a kite rises not in still air, but against the wind. The very resistance that seems to oppose its flight becomes the force that lifts it higher. Your psychological freedom operates on a similar principle. It expands not through the removal of all demands, but through engagement with meaningful challenges that align with your deepest values. You've likely noticed this paradox in your own experience. Those moments when you felt most alive, most fulfilled, most genuinely free, were they times of complete absence of responsibility? Or were they times when you were fully engaged in contributing to something that deeply mattered to you? The answer reveals a profound truth about human psychology. We come alive not through escape from obligation, but through purposeful engagement with worthy challenges. This reality contradicts much conventional wisdom about psychological well-being. When feeling overwhelmed, the standard advice often suggests reducing responsibilities and lightening your load. While temporary strategic withdrawal can support recovery, sustained resilience comes not from avoiding challenge, but from connecting to a purpose larger than yourself. Think of psychological freedom not as the absence of weight, but as the strength to carry meaningful weight with grace. Just as physical strength develops through strategic resistance rather than its absence, mental resilience grows through purposeful engagement rather than avoidance. This isn't about taking on more obligations indiscriminately. It's about aligning your efforts with what truly matters to you. The impact paradox reveals itself through three crucial dimensions. First, responsibility creates rather than limits freedom. When you take ownership of meaningful challenges, you develop the capacity to handle greater complexity with less effort. Your psychological range expands. Second, contribution generates rather than depletes energy. When your efforts connect to genuine purpose, you access motivation and stamina unavailable to those focused solely on self-interest. Third, service expands rather than diminishes personal growth. The challenges of contributing to others' well-being push you to develop capacities that self-focused pursuits never would. Your resilience withers when directed solely towards self-protection, but flourishes when connected to something larger than yourself. This isn't about neglecting self-care. It's about recognizing that sustainable psychological strength comes through meaningful impact rather than just self-preservation. The strongest mindsets aren't focused primarily on their own well-being, but on their contribution to others. The key lies in distinguishing between depleting obligations and energizing contributions. Not every responsibility serves your growth or connects to genuine purpose. Some obligations genuinely need reduction or elimination. But others, those aligned with your deepest values and highest aspirations, actually create the psychological freedom you seek. Purpose becomes the lens through which you evaluate which responsibilities to embrace and which to release. This isn't about taking on more, it's about engaging more purposefully with what truly matters. The weight of meaningless obligation indeed constrains, but the weight of purposeful responsibility paradoxically liberates. Those who develop truly bulletproof mindsets understand this fundamental truth. Psychological freedom doesn't come from having no responsibilities, but from having the right responsibilities, those that align with their deepest values and highest potential for positive impact. They don't seek to eliminate challenges from their lives, but to engage with challenges worthy of their capabilities. This perspective transforms how you view life's demands. Instead of asking, "How can I reduce my responsibilities?" you begin asking, "Which responsibilities align with my highest purpose?" Instead of seeking freedom through escape from obligation, you discover it through meaningful contribution. The very challenges that seem to constrain you become the forces that lift you higher, just like the wind beneath a kite's wings. We are most free not when we have no obligations, but when our obligations align with our deepest values. This truth points toward the ultimate expression of a bulletproof mindset, using your unique capacities not just to withstand difficulty, but to create a positive impact in the world. When you connect your resilience to a purpose larger than yourself, you become not just unshakable but unstoppable in pursuing what truly matters. Conclusion. You've come a long way from where you began this journey. When you first opened these chapters, perhaps you felt at the mercy of circumstances, watching as criticism shattered your confidence, uncertainty paralyzed your decisions, and setbacks depleted your resilience. Now, standing at the conclusion of this transformative exploration, you possess something invaluable, a mind that transforms challenges into catalysts for growth. Remember the fortress metaphor we began with? Your mind was like a structure with walls that could either be easily breached or made impenetrable. Through each chapter, you've reinforced these walls, not with rigid resistance, but with psychological flexibility. You've learned that true strength comes not from avoiding discomfort, but from metabolizing it differently. The shift in how you process experiences now is profound. Where criticism once devastated you, you now extract valuable feedback while maintaining your center. When uncertainty appears, rather than triggering anxiety, it awakens your curiosity. Instead of exhausting yourself through constant resistance to circumstances, you conserve energy through strategic acceptance while focusing on what you can control. Yet understand this clearly. Building a bulletproof mindset is not a destination, but an ongoing process. Each time you apply these principles, whether creating space between stimulus and response, choosing perspective over reaction, or converting triggers into opportunities, you strengthen your mental architecture. Just as physical strength builds through consistent exercise, your psychological resilience deepens with each conscious application. This doesn't mean you won't face challenges or experience difficult emotions. The bulletproof mindset doesn't eliminate problems. It transforms your relationship with them. Experiences that once devastated you become opportunities for growth. Situations that once triggered reactivity now invite conscious response. Your expanded capacity now serves a greater purpose. The ultimate expression of a bulletproof mindset isn't just withstanding difficulty. It's using your psychological strength to create meaningful impact in the world. You can remain centered amid chaos, choose response over reaction, extract growth from adversity, and maintain perspective when others lose theirs. Picture yourself now, standing atop your psychological fortress, surveying life's landscape with clarity and confidence. The terrain hasn't changed, but you have. Your mind now transforms obstacles into opportunities, challenges into catalysts, and setbacks into stepping stones. The truth you've discovered is profound. With a bulletproof mindset, you become not just unshakable but unstoppable in pursuing what truly matters. Your journey of strengthening your mind has only begun, but you now possess the principles and practices to continue building resilience that serves not just your own growth, but your capacity to contribute to the world around you. Thank you for listening to my audiobook. Thank you for listening to my audiobook. You've taken the first step. Now go write your story, one action at a time. You've got this.